You know, we like to think of history as the steady, unstoppable march toward progress. But what happens when an entire society, actually scratch that, when multiple, modern, educated, civilized societies just collectively decide to walk straight into the abyss? Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're not just memorizing dates or looking at battle lines on a map. We are diving deep into the psychology, the mass manipulation, and the sheer, unimaginable human tragedy of the deadliest conflict in human history. We're going to explore exactly how ordinary people, driven by fear, humiliation, and a desperate thirst for revenge, literally transform their nations into apocalyptic war machines.
60 to 80 million. Just sit with that number for a second. That isn't just a statistic. That's the total number of human lives completely extinguished between 1939 and 1945. It's a figure so massive it's almost impossible to wrap your head around. We're talking about entire generations erased, families, futures, whole cities literally reduced to ash. And you know what the truly haunting part is? This wasn't some natural disaster. This was a man-made apocalypse. To figure out how we engineered our own destruction on a scale like that, we have to go back. We have to look at the psychological wounds that were left to fester in the dark.
So let's start with the wounded world and the seeds of resentment that started it all. See, the victors of the First World War really believed they had just fought the war to end all wars. But in reality, what they actually did was plant the perfect ingredients for total societal collapse. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just defeat Germany on the battlefield. It was designed to crush them psychologically with a deeply humiliating war guilt clause. Add in massive losses of territory, reparations they could never possibly pay. And then, the 1929 Great Depression, the global economy just absolutely flatlined. In Germany, the currency became so utterly worthless that people were literally burning stacks of money just to keep their homes warm. And history shows us, time and time again, that when a society gets this desperate, this starving, they stop listening to reason, and they start listening to radical, very dangerous voices.
Which brings us to the rise of obsession and the terrifying vision of the Führer.
Right in the middle of all this terrifying chaos, Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party stepped up. And they manipulated this deep national despair with a precision that is just chilling. Hitler promised to rip up the Treaty of Versailles and return a wounded, broken nation to this mythical state of glory. But the dark core of his vision was a concept called Lebensraum, meaning living space. See, Hitler didn't just want to fix a broken economy. He harbored this twisted, pseudo-scientific obsession with absolute racial purity. He truly believed his so-called Aryan race was biologically superior, and therefore they inherently required vast new territories in the East to expand. This wasn't your standard territorial greed. To them, this was biological destiny. And if this superior race needed space, well, that directly justified the annihilation of anyone they deemed inferior, particularly the Slavs and the Jews.
The extermination of the Jewish race in Germany. Let that sink in. He didn't say that in the heat of battle in 1944. Adolf Hitler wrote that in his manifesto Mein Kampf in 1923, literally years before he ever took power. The unimaginable horrors that were about to unfold, they weren't some tragic accident of war. This was a premeditated, ideological obsession, and it was laid out in broad daylight. He told the entire world exactly what he was going to do. And the ultimate tragedy here is, no one stopped him when they had the chance.
Instead, the world just watched. They were gripped by this absolute psychological paralysis. Hitler started testing the waters around 1935. He rebuilt the military, built up the Luftwaffe, directly violating the peace treaty. And what did the international community do? Well, they condemned him, sure, but they did absolutely nothing to actually stop him. So he pushed further. In 1938, he annexes Austria without firing a shot. Then he extorts the Sudetenland from Czechoslovakia. Britain and France were so paralyzed by the fear of starting another massive war that they just gave him what he wanted. They hoped it would satisfy his appetite. But you can't appease an obsession, right? This whole condemn but do nothing approach just proved to Hitler that the democracies were incredibly weak. Finally, in September 1939, after securing a completely shocking non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, his sworn ideological enemies, Hitler invaded Poland. The line had finally been crossed.
And that plunged the world into the Lightning War, leading to the sudden fall of the West.
When global conflict officially broke out again, this horribly outdated military psychology slammed right into the terrifying reality of modern slaughter. It was a literal clash of eras. The French strategy was entirely defensive. They relied heavily on the Maginot Line, which was this massive, elaborate chain of fortifications, and they prepared for the slow, static trench warfare they remembered from World War I. But Germany wasn't fighting World War I anymore.
They unleashed Blitzkrieg, lightning war. We're talking fast-moving panzer tanks, overwhelming Luftwaffe air support, and a relentless, terrifying speed that cut straight through the dense Ardennes forest, a place, by the way, the French were convinced was completely impenetrable to tanks. It was a psychological shock and awe campaign that absolutely shattered the Allied lines.
35 days. That is all it took. France, a massive global superpower, one of the primary victors of the First World War with one of the strongest armies on paper, completely collapsed in just over a single month. It is really hard to overstate the profound psychological shock this sent rippling around the world. It was a sweeping, completely unthinkable victory. British forces barely managed to escape at Dunkirk, leaving practically all their equipment behind. Hitler was standing triumphant in Paris. And just like that, Britain was left completely and entirely alone on the edge of Europe. But the nightmare was only expanding. We now enter the era of industrialized slaughter, a true descent into darkness.
After Hitler failed to break Britain through relentless bombing campaigns, he made what would become a catastrophic decision. He turned his eyes to the east, kicking off a nightmare that was unlike anything in human history. Operation Barbarossa was the largest military invasion ever launched, period. But you have to understand this wasn't just a war for territory. It was a war of absolute ideological extermination against what Hitler called Judeo-Bolshevism. The brutality on the Eastern Front was apocalyptic. Take the siege of Leningrad, a blockade that lasted nearly 900 days. Over 1 million people perished there, mostly just freezing and starving to death. And then there's the Battle of Stalingrad. The relentless German war machine was finally halted by this ferocious Soviet defense and brutal sub-zero winters. Soldiers were fighting room by room, literally floor by floor in a ruined city, until the Germans were finally forced into a disastrous surrender, taking massive casualties. The Eastern Front essentially became this grotesque meat grinder that consumed millions upon millions of human lives.
And while this unimaginably bloody war raged on the front lines, a horror of a completely different kind was being meticulously executed in the shadows. The final solution: the systematic, industrialized murder of 6 million Jews, alongside millions of other marginalized people, including the Romani, the disabled, and political dissidents. This right here is the ultimate psychological abyss of the entire war, because we are forced to confront the fact that the entire machinery of a modern, bureaucratic state, its railways, its factories, its top engineers, was seamlessly repurposed with the sole, terrifying objective of genocide. Places like Auschwitz and Treblinka, they stand today as permanent, chilling monuments to just how far the human soul can fall when it becomes utterly consumed by hatred and propaganda.
This leads us to the apocalyptic climax, as the entire world is consumed.
Because while Europe was drowning in blood, tensions on the exact opposite side of the planet were reaching a massive boiling point. It was this fatal domino effect driven by sheer desperation. Japan, lacking basic natural resources but completely driven by a hardcore militaristic government, invaded China and Manchuria to secure vital things like oil and minerals, while the United States responded by absolutely choking Japan economically, imposing these crushing economic sanctions and freezing all Japanese assets. Cornered and rapidly running out of the oil they needed to survive, Japan calculated a massive all-or-nothing gamble. They launched a devastating surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. In just a single morning, over 2,300 Americans were killed. But instead of breaking American resolve like Japan hoped, it instantaneously unified a very divided American public. The sleeping giant had been pulled directly into the inferno.
And with the unbelievable industrial might of the U.S. entering the fray, combined with the relentless, seemingly endless manpower of the Soviet Union, the tide finally began a bloody, grinding turn. In 1942, the U.S. Navy pulled off a miraculous win at the Battle of Midway, completely shifting the balance of power in the Pacific. By June of 1944, a staggering 156,000 Allied troops stormed the heavily fortified beaches of Normandy on D-Day, violently breaking their way back into Western Europe. Meanwhile, over in the east, the Soviet Red Army was relentlessly pushing the German forces all the way back, ultimately capturing Berlin in 1945. Hitler died by suicide in his bunker, and Hitler's Reich in Europe was officially crushed. But the global nightmare, it wasn't quite over yet.
Which brings us to the echoes of the abyss and the ultimate birth of modern fear. To force the final, unconditional surrender of Japan, and to avoid what would have been a catastrophic,
unimaginably deadly land invasion, humanity crossed a line from which it could literally never return. In August 1945, the United States dropped a newly developed, highly classified weapon on the city of Hiroshima, the atomic bomb. 15 kilotons of explosive force. The destruction was practically godlike. 80,000 human beings were vaporized or crushed in a fraction of a single second. And by the end of the year, radiation and severe injuries pushed that death toll up to a staggering 166,000. A second bomb was dropped on Nagasaki. And finally, Japan surrendered. The war was officially over. But humanity had just irrevocably proven that it now possessed the technological capacity to completely wipe itself off the face of the earth.
Of the roughly 80 million people dead in this war, 25 million were military, but a jaw-dropping 55 million were civilians. Let that ratio sink in. This is perhaps the most defining, haunting psychological legacy of World War II. The line between the battlefield and the home front, it just vanished entirely. Whole cities were leveled to dust. Entire populations were deliberately starved. Ordinary families, people just trying to live their lives, paid the absolute ultimate price for the massive egos and ambitions of dictators. War had fundamentally evolved from armies clashing on a distant field into a machine of total, systematic annihilation.
So the guns fell silent, and the war ended. But it certainly didn't end in perfect peace. The world was left deeply fractured. Germany was divided into 4 occupation zones by the victors. The surviving architects of the Nazi horror finally faced justice at the unprecedented Nuremberg trials. But the aftermath of the war also brutally exposed some deep, painful hypocrisies within the victorious nations. For instance, over 1 million Black Americans fought valiantly for freedom abroad, only to return home to the brutal, systemic discrimination of Jim Crow segregation. And finally, the 2 emerging global superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, almost immediately turned on each other, plunging an already traumatized, grieving world straight into a terrifying, decades-long nuclear arms race.
So, what does this all mean for us today? We built the machinery to destroy ourselves. Have we actually learned how to stop it? World War II wasn't just a physical clash of global armies. It was a total, devastating collapse of the human soul. It showed us in the starkest terms possible the terrifying power of mass manipulation, the sheer danger of unchecked hatred, and the devastating, irreversible cost of apathy. The very world we live in right now, our borders, our global anxieties, our international institutions, every bit of it was entirely forged in that fire. As we try to comprehend the psychological wounds that caused this descent into hell, we really have to ask ourselves, have those wounds ever truly healed? Or are we just waiting for the right spark? Keep learning, keep questioning everything, and I'll see you in the next explainer.